Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Today I'll be talking about the concept of knowledge in the Quran and education. But before I start, everyone can hear me all right? And can you see the screen? Let me know if you can't, and Brother Salman will do something about it. Okay, so I'll be talking about the concept of knowledge in the Quran and how it relates to education, right? So, first of all, what constitutes knowledge or the term ilm in the Quran? When we hear the term ilm, we usually think of it as knowledge about the Quran and the Sunnah, which it is, definitely, right? But the thesis of this presentation is that ilm or knowledge in the Quran is a wide concept that encompasses every kind of knowledge, and not just a religious kind of knowledge, which is a distinction that came much later on, as we will see. Right, here's it's Begovic talking about this. He said no society can implement even the four basic acts of faith, right, without also pulling itself into civilization. Let me give you a simple example. Right, early Arabs invented the entire field of astronomy just so they'll know which way the Qibla is when they were traveling. Right, that is the kind of impact Islam has on people's thinking. The implication of this thesis, or the idea, is that a small shift in understanding, if we observe it historically, in what is meant by knowledge or ilm in Islam, results in very different outcomes for the community, as we will see. Right. So, what does the Quran say? Like, let's see how the Quran talks about the concept of ilm. The Quran is unique among all religious texts in being very outward-looking in perspective. Right? How many other signs in the heavens and the earth which people pass by without giving any heed? Right. So, for instance, if you ask, like, well, how do I increase my faith in the Quran? What does the Quran say? It basically says, look outwards. Don't look inwards. Look outwards. Look at the stars. Observe nature. Study the water cycle. Observe, study the history of the great civilizations before us, especially like the Egyptian civilization. Now, interestingly, one of the reasons why the Egyptian civilization collapsed was because the pharaohs violated the prohibition on incest that every religion and every society has had since the beginning of time. Now, it's one of those few things where science and religion are in perfect agreement, right? That lack of genetic variability is a bad thing, right? So the Quran says, look outwards and look at your history and look at the world around you in order to increase your own faith. So the Quran has never really distinguishes between worldly and spiritual kinds of knowledge. It's all part of the same thing, right? Um, Also, in the Quran, participating in the world is a means of attaining personal salvation, right? Instead of saying have faith and then you will do good deeds, the Quran basically says do good deeds and faith will happen and you will have faith. Right? Righteousness is not that you turn your faces towards east or west. It is to believe in Allah. It is to spend of the wealth that you love and to be patient in adversity. Right? The Quran does not distinguish between worldly and spiritual knowledge or between worldly and spiritual actions. It's all part of the same thing. Now let's look at the hadiths and how they talk about the concept of knowledge. The Prophet ﷺ once said, now here's a hadith you don't hear every day, right? He said, to be present in the circle of a learned man is better than making 1,000 prostrations, or visiting 1,000 sick people, or attending 1,000 funerals. And one of the companions asked, is it also better than reading the Quran? And to his surprise, the Prophet ﷺ said, what use, what good is reading the Quran except through knowledge? Right? The reason he said this is because we cannot understand the answers in the Quran without understanding something about the world around us. Right? Here's an example from my own area of related to my area of research. Around 1 million people commit suicides every year. Right? If you want to understand the meaning of the term "La tahzanullah ma'ana," right, you cannot understand the gravity of that of a verse like that without actually understanding like how many people all over the world end up taking their own lives for all kinds of reasons, like including depression and including economic despair and so on. Right. So here's another example. Oppression. Here's a concept. Oppression is related to lack of power, something the Quran states very clearly. Here's Noam Chomsky talking about the state of Palestinians. He says part of the tragedy of the Palestinians is that they don't have wealth and they don't have power, and so they don't have rights. Right? The Quran talks about this. Right? And the Quran says this 1,500 years ago. The Quran talks about the same concept. We simply can't understand the answers in the Quran without understanding the questions by looking at the world around us. Right? Without that kind of a background, a verse like this would just mean just won't mean much to us. So the Quran does not distinguish, never distinguishes between worldly and spiritual knowledge, and does not distinguish between worldly and spiritual actions either. Now, what is the consequence of understanding the concept of knowledge or ilm in this sense, the sense it's in which it is meant to be understood? Right, this gives us the golden age of social, economic, scientific, and political prosperity. Right, we won't get into that discussion here, but I can refer you to some really good works, especially by the Iraqi British physicist Jamil Khalili, written a really good book on the subject. Right, and the intellectual progress that was generated by the Quran lasted for 10 centuries after the Prophet ﷺ. Right, whereas the political system devolved into monarchies very quickly. We'll come to that. Right. So what changed around the 16th century? What went wrong after that? Right. Many causes have been identified. Some of these are very lazy kinds of generalizations. Like if you listen to most Western thinkers, the first thing that they will say is, the first thing they'll say is, "Oh, Ghazali became a mystic, and he took the entire Islamic world along with him." But the fact is, Ghazali died 400 years before any of this happened, right? And he was one of many remarkable thinkers who lived at the same time, like Ibn Rushd and many others, right? And you will always notice that people who make this kind of an argument have invariably never read any Ghazali. And if you read Ghazali, you realize this is not at all the kind of attitude he promotes. The other factor, and there's some truth to this one, is that the political state of Islam quickly devolved, which had long since devolved into monarchies from the Khilafats, right? Felt threatened by the intellectual progress coming back and hunting them, right? And of course, this is a problem that continues and persists to the present day. The third one, which we hear pretty much every Friday, is that we're not religious enough, that we're not praying enough, and we're not asking for enough forgiveness. Now here's Robert Fisk, who's who spent the past 40 years recording, reporting on every major tragedy in the Middle East, right, for the past 4 decades, right? And he's talking about Muslims, right? And he says Muslims still believe the Quran is the word of God Himself, right? The idea of Islam dominates their life in a way that Christianity used to maybe 200 years ago. And he says, so the question for the Muslims is this: how is it that people who have kept their faith have come to be dominated economically, militarily, socially, and culturally by people who have largely lost their faith? Right. By the way, I highly recommend reading his last book before he died in 2020, Night of Power. It gives you a very, very good understanding of, the current state of the world. So to answer his question, I suspect the answer is not so much in the lack of religiosity itself, but in what we think constitutes religiosity. That is what has actually changed. The Quran slowly became an object of veneration rather than a call of action. Right? This was a fundamental problem lying at the heart of the decline of Muslims. Right? As the Begovic said, the Quran was read less and recited more. Right? So for the first time, worldly knowledge, now in quotes, becomes distinct and less desirable than religious pursuits, right? And it gets replaced by theological concerns. Now, this is not a new idea. I mean, Iqbal spoke about this 100 years ago. If you read his Iblis Ka Majlis Shora, which I highly recommend reading if you know Urdu, he says, Ibn Maryam mar gaya ya zinda Javed hai sifat ज़ात हक हक से जुदा या आइन ज़ात क्या मुसलमान के लिए काफ़ी नहीं इस दौर में ये इलाहियात की दर्शे हुए लातमन्नात. So, along with this kind of distinction between worldly and spiritual knowledge, comes a decline in scientific progress, comes a loss of political power, regression, gender equality, and all bad things happen. So, what is the way forward? What can we do about it? First, at a personal level, and in Islam, everything starts at the personal level, right? At the personal level, we need to have a deep-rooted understanding that all knowledge can be religious knowledge. It depends on our perspective. It depends on our attitude towards it, right? And we have to pursue it with the same kind of fervor with which we pursue religious, ideals. It's not something that happens automatically. It's something that you have to work towards constantly on a daily basis, right? This is where initiatives like mine and CSPS, whom we met last week, become so important. I remember a story like at one point in time, my dad and his friends were trying to collect some funds to start a library, right? And one very rich, and they were really struggling. They were hardly able to get any kind of funding for this kind of an initiative. And one very rich person told him, if you want to build a mosque, I'll give you the entire amount right now, no questions asked. But what's all this nonsense about libraries? Right? It is that kind of short-sightedness that lies at the heart of all our miseries in the present day. Right. So at the social level, what can we do? The answer is simple, right? Okay. Before that, okay. At the social level, uh, understanding, having a broad concept of knowledge helps us not just in being more socially active, but also helps us practice Islam better in pluralistic societies, right? Because living as Muslims in pluralistic societies often require ingenious solutions. I'll give you one an example that I've seen since I was little, right? Muslims in Malabar invented a concept called Korean piety. Those of you who speak Malayalam might be familiar with this, right? Muslims in Malabar invented a concept of Korean piety as social trust alternatives to interest-based loans. Right, it was a remarkably simple and very beautiful idea, right? Where I can talk about this more on question answers if anyone's interested, right? But the idea is to pool one's idle wealth, like whatever extra money you have, you idle it. You take all that idle wealth and you pool it, and then you take turns passing it on to each other. This completely circumventing the need to go to a bank and take an interest-based loan, right? And this has worked for generations after generations, and they helped Muslims in Malabar economically. Right. So, for example, a farmer gets the money whenever he needs to buy seeds, and the manufacturer gets it when they need to buy raw materials, and fishermen get it whenever they need to buy nets and so on. So you get the basic idea, right? This entire system, right, of social trust keeps people out of interest-based debts, right? Which is why Muslims do a lot better socioeconomically in the Malabar region than you see in most of the parts of India, right? And it also allows for other things. It allows for sustainable farming, sustainable fishing. Most of the problems that we have with climate change, right, has to do with the fact that most corporates work in a system where they have such huge amounts of interest that they have nothing, they have no alternative but to exploit whatever resources they have to the maximum possible extent, right? So you get sustainable farming and fishing and all of these really good environmentally friendly initiatives, right? When people don't have to worry about having to deal with an interest-based system. This kind of a system works even better than microfinance. Most of you may never have heard of this, and nobody won any Nobel prizes. Nobody writes articles about it in New York Times, right? But it works really, really well, right? It helps people economically, and it helps them avoid. It helps them practice as better Muslims, and it also helps them economically and socially. At the social level, the implications of all this is the answer is simple. Like it's not easy to implement, but it is simple. It is educate, educate, educate. Right? Muslims have the lowest levels of education, right? Especially in a country like India, right? However, to be fair, although we always criticize for this, right? Religious affiliation is not the best predictor of education levels of a community, right? If you look at a place like United States or anywhere in the world, the best predictors of education levels is socioeconomic status and availability of schools. Now, unfortunately for us, Muslims are also pretty much at the bottom of the ladder when it comes to socioeconomic status, number of schools, and so on. So it is an uphill battle, and it's a very difficult cause to take up, right? As most people, like we were hearing from CSPS last week, right? Most people realize very quickly that education is something that gets very, very little support, whether it's financially or intellectually, from the larger population or even from the community. Right, and education is important, especially for women, right? And there's a reason for this because women um, are much more intellectually, socially, and politically active than men. Like, for instance, I work in like clinical research. You'll be amazed at the number of papers published, clinical research papers published by Muslim women in areas like psychiatry or dentistry and other areas of medicine and so on. Right. There's also another reason why education for women is so important. Women don't give up easily. Like Arundhati Roy was talking about participation of women in popular in popular protests, and she says, like, if you have a bunch of men who are running a protest, it's very easy to get rid of them. Just give them some money, buy them some alcohol, they'll go away. Women don't do that. Like, they see things through, right? So education for women is the pathway for social change in the community. And finally, what all this requires a great deal of patience. Education may be a perfect solution to the problems that we're facing, right? But it's a very slow process in bringing about social change, right? But it is the only certain way in which things are going to change for us as a community, for the larger population, right? It takes decades of tireless work to bring about any change in the society, right? As we see from the shift in public opinion about issues like Israel and Palestine in North America and so on. Right? It takes a very long time to bring about a shift in public opinion or bring about any real change in a society. Right? Thank you all for listening. That's it.